All right, this meeting is now being recorded. And Emily, I will pass it to you to start.
Great, thank you so much. And everybody's gonna have to excuse me. I have a little bit of a frog in my throat, trying to get over a cold. But good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Weinstein. I'm the director of the Housing and Community Development Department for the city of Oakland. And today we are here really to get people excited about the BAHFA bond, which is a groundbreaking opportunity that hopefully will be on the November ballot. And before we get started tonight, we have live interpretation available in Spanish and Cantonese, and we want to share instructions for how to use it. So you'll see on the slide here, to use simultaneous interpretation, first click on the globe icon to see the language channels as shown here. If you do not see the globe icon, move your mouse around the edge of your screen or exit full screen. Second, you must select a channel. So if you wish to listen to English, select English. You can move between language channels at any time. I'll give everyone a second to adjust if needed to choose your language channel.
And this is where interpreters feel free to share the instructions in the other languages now.
Okay. Thank you all. Please let us know if you have any difficulties by raising your hand. And if we don't see anything, then we will continue to move on. Next slide. So this moment is unlike any other in our region's history. We are approaching creating solutions to homelessness and housing from a regional perspective in a way that can define what's to come for years. What makes this even more remarkable is the unprecedented amount of funding that the BAHFA bond brings, and most importantly, how it will impact our beloved city of Oakland. This evening, we'll be talking about what the Regional Housing Bond is, a bit about what we call ACA 1, a potential companion ballot measure that will be a crucial component in November. Next, we will talk about Oakland's Housing and Community Development's 2023 to 2027 Strategic Action Plan, which outlines the city's priorities for housing and lays the foundation for how we spend our current funding sources and the future BAHFA bond. The Strategic Action Plan lays out our racial equity framework, guiding principles, and spending plan. Lastly, we'll hear from our partners at Alameda County about their planning process for the BAHFA bond. And just to let you know how the presentation will work, within each section, we'll pause to discuss the content and open it up for dialogue and questions. Next slide. Before we start, we have the privilege of welcoming some distinguished elected leaders from our community who are our co-hosts tonight. Let me start by introducing Alameda County Supervisor Lena Tam, who will say a few words about the importance of this opportunity. Welcome.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for hosting this really important forum. So a lot of people wonder why public funds are needed to lessen the rent burden for low-income and working families. It is because we have public funds that we are able to engage in the kind of projects that are really going to be part and parcel of supporting housing and making it more affordable for middle and lower income residents who have been increasingly squeezed by the high housing costs. For example, just to build affordable housing in Alameda County, we're finding that it costs $1 million per unit. And without these kind of public support and funding that we used to have a long time ago with redevelopment funds, and then as recently the county has with Measure A1, we would not be able to provide a lot of the housing that have been built. Like, for example, In the county, we were able to put in over 4,000 housing units just from the last housing bond in 2016, which will be ending in 2026. And in my district alone, we had built over 1,300 units. My district includes Oakland, Chinatown, the areas in around the Port of Oakland, Oakland Airport, Little Saigon, and we would not be able to get the kind of housing for low-income seniors. We built like over 108 units. So these kind of projects are going to be critical to stem the tide of increasing homelessness in the county and in particular in Oakland, and drive the construction investments and jobs that are needed. So I'm really gratified to have this opportunity to participate in this forum and help move this housing bond, regional housing bond forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Supervisor. Also joining us tonight, we have City of Oakland Council President, Nikki Fortunato Bass from District 2. And so I don't believe Councilmember Gallo is on right now. So Council President Bass, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Supervisor Tam. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I really appreciate everyone making time this evening. So again, my name is Nikki Fortunato Bass. I'm serving as Oakland City Council President, and I represent District 2 on the City Council. It's our most racially diverse district in Oakland, stretching from Jack London Square and Chinatown to Little Saigon, as well as Eastlake and San Antonio to Grand Lake and Crocker Highlands. It's also one of the most economically diverse districts, with Eastlake, for example, on the front lines of gentrification and displacement. And every day we hear from our residents who want affordable housing for teachers and working people, as well as for transitional age youth, for seniors and people who are currently homeless. I believe housing is a human right, and I'm honored to serve also on the Association of Bay Area Governments Executive Board and Housing Committee, which recently approved this regional housing bond to be placed on the November ballot. And the final step towards the ballot is the approval by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. As you will hear over the course of this evening, Measure U in Oakland is one of our biggest tools, and I'm happy to have co-authored that measure, which voters overwhelmingly approved in November. That is $350 million in bond funding for affordable housing to support up to 2,400 affordable housing units in the coming years, our largest investment in Oakland ever. And at the same time, it's not enough. So this regional bond measure is really critical for us. But just to give you a sense of how important these funds are, with Measure U, we funded our first batch of projects just last year, and we broke ground on one of the first projects at East 12th Street and 2nd Avenue near Lake Merritt. And that's 91 units of permanently affordable housing, 100% affordable housing, with 25 permanent supportive housing units for homeless individuals. And so that gives you a sense of the promise of these funds. That project is one of several in our housing pipeline that are going to be breaking ground soon. So today you'll hear more about BAHFA, or the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, and our regional effort to address housing affordability and the displacement crisis head on. I'm really looking forward to our city's Housing and Community Development Department sharing information with you. They are a leader in the region, prioritizing units for homeless and very low income residents in order to meet our city's greatest need. And that is with guidance from a very clear strategic plan as well as an equity framework. And so in Oakland, we have an opportunity with this regional bond to triple affordable housing units over the next 7 years. We also, across the entire county, have an opportunity to create what's essentially a public bank to continue lending funds dedicated for affordable housing. So it's a really important and exciting potential partnership with the city of Oakland, the county, and the entire region. And lastly, I'll just say that I think affordable housing and jobs go hand in hand. These dollars are going to come with labor standards in the form of prevailing wages in construction jobs, as well as apprenticeship opportunities. And so as we deal with the crisis of economic inequality, the consequences of homelessness, lack of housing affordability, and lack of living wage jobs, this regional bond measure can help address that crisis with affordable housing as well as good jobs and really help us turn the corner for our residents. So it's very exciting to be able to share this information with all of you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President. All right, so next, I don't believe the Councilmember Gallo is here, but if he's able to join us, we will stop and get a few words from him. So, what is BAHFA? BAHFA stands for the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. BAHFA is the agency leading the bond proposal, and they have the power to raise funding through ballot measures across the region. They just approved a resolution last week to put a $20 billion, or actually a few weeks ago now, to put a $20 billion bond on this year's November ballot. BAHFA is the first regional housing finance agency in the state and was created by California state legislators, championed by Assemblymember David Chu in 2019. The agency's primary mission is to address housing affordability challenges at scale, which is critical since the issue of housing and homelessness are bigger than any one neighborhood, city, or county. Most importantly, the agency collaborates with and is governed by representatives from local governments across all 9 Bay Area counties. Next slide. The regional bond is being explored as either a $10 billion or $20 billion general obligation bond to address affordable housing across our 9 counties. It's looking like it will be a $20 billion bond, but that will be confirmed over the next couple of months. These dollars will be raised through a tax on property owners, and because it is a general obligation bond, the primary focus is funding for capital and capital needs. This means the dollars cannot currently be used for services like eviction defense or homeless prevention services, but there may be other avenues to support that work that we will be exploring. Next slide. Raising funds for affordable housing is imperative. With the loss of the redevelopment agency in 2012, we haven't had a consistent source of funds to put towards affordable housing. Without that consistency, it becomes difficult for developers and policy makers to plan for the future and takes longer for projects to be developed. If the BAHFA bond is passed as a $10 billion bond, Oakland would receive about $380 million. If it's a $20 billion bond, then that'll be double, or we'll double that at basically $765 million. The purpose and goal of the bond are to address what we call the 3 Ps: production, preservation, and protection of affordable housing. BAHFA has established certain spending guidelines. However, there's also a lot of flexibility in there. For production, which is our name for the creation of new homes, BAHFA will require at least 52% of the funds towards production. Preservation is our work to ensure current existing housing remains habitable, safe, and affordable, and at least 15% of funds will go to these activities. The remaining 33% of funds from BAHFA will be flexible and may look different for each city or county. We'll discuss how Oakland specifically plans to use these dollars later in the presentation. So what is a general obligation bond? A general obligation bond is issued by the government, purchased by investors, and repaid by property owners over time. For Oakland voters, we thank you for passing Measure U in November of 2022, which was the largest general obligation bond for affordable housing for our city. The impact of these dollars has been tremendous. We have the incredible honor to allocate $350 million over the next several years towards the production and preservation of affordable housing for Oaklanders. As Council President Bass mentioned, we have already broken ground on a project at East 12th using Measure U. We will be breaking ground actually tomorrow for another Measure U project, and we have 2 more that will be breaking ground within the next few months. There is also a large pipeline. We know based on our previous new construction NOFAs, that there's a pipeline of projects that are ready. If not for funding, they would be able to start construction and bring on deeply affordable and much necessary affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness, as well as a mix of income levels. In a general obligation bond, property owners will pay based on their assessed value as shown on their property tax bill. Also, as it stands, region-wide voters must currently approve general obligation bonds by a 2/3 vote, which is a very, very high threshold. That is where ACA 1 comes in, which is a companion ballot measure this November, which would bring down this threshold from 2/3 to 55% for general obligation bonds. Next slide. As mentioned on our previous slide, property owners will fund this bond through annual taxes, which will be based on their assessed value as shown on their property tax bill. As of 2024, this amounts to approximately $12 to $19 per $100,000 of assessed value, depending on the bond's total size. So for example, if a property is assessed at $1 million, the owner will pay about $190 per year for a $20 billion bond. Next slide. Another item that will be on the ballot is what we call ACA 1, Assembly Constitutional Amendment 1, or ACA 1. What ACA 1 does is lower the voter threshold for the passage of a general obligation bond. As I mentioned earlier, this is critical because it's difficult to get a 2/3 vote to pass the bond. ACA 1 would lower this threshold to 55%, so the bond is more likely to pass. Notably, this is something that has already been done for school districts, and they've been able to successfully build school facilities over the years. So it's really important that we not only talk about the BAHFA bond, but also look at passing ACA 1 as well. Next slide. So if passed this November, the way the 2024 Regional Housing Bond is structured is that 80% of the funds will be allocated as direct allocations to counties or cities. Given Oakland's size, we will be receiving a direct allocation. As for the remaining 20% of the money, it will be spent by BAHFA at their discretion for affordable housing, like a public bank, to invest in affordable housing and recirculate their returns on their investment back into projects, thereby creating an ongoing source of funding for affordable housing production and preservation. Next slide. Counties and cities receiving bond funds will need to create expenditure plans that describe how the funds will be used. The plans must be approved at local public meetings, like the Oakland City Council, and the public will have an opportunity to comment on the plans. If passed, annual reports will also be required to communicate progress on expenditures and towards our overall housing goals. Right, next slide. So we're going to pause here. I know that was a lot of information about both the BAHFA bond as well as ACA 1. And so we just want to pause here to see if there are any questions. What else do you want to know about BAHFA? And what about the proposals, both the regional bond and ACA 1, makes you hopeful or nervous about the future? And I do want to reiterate that we will get into the details of our strategy plan and expenditure plan in the next section.
So everybody, you can either feel free to raise your hand and we could ask you to unmute, or you can type any questions or comments in the Q&A box, and then we can have a discussion and answer your questions live through there. I do see one hand raised, but again, feel free to either raise your hand or put questions or comments into the Q&A box. Carlos, I'm going to allow you to talk now. And ask to, sorry, press the button, ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
Good. Hi, everyone. Good night. Good evening, and thank you for putting this together. My concern for Oakland with respect to affordable housing is stabilization of communities. I understand the need to create as many units as possible, but meanwhile, we're seeing destabilization of communities as a result of economic pressures, particularly in lower income census tracts with legacy homeowners, African American, Latino. So I'm curious how all of this will translate not just into production of units, but into stabilization of communities so that we don't end up being a city where we have low-income people who are, or low-income housing that's just for people of color, while the rest of the city is, and I'm talking about 20, 30 years from now, less diverse. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, there's a question in the chat that actually dovetails on this pretty well. So I would love to read that and then maybe answer together. But in the chat, there's a question: where does protection fall into this scenario? I see production, preservation, and flexible. So what about protection?
Yeah, great questions. So we will speak specifically to the expenditure plan, the proposed expenditure plan, which includes both production and preservation. So there's a significant amount of money towards preservation, and preservation can look different kinds of strategies. In terms of protection, as we mentioned, this is a general obligation bond. And so there's a limit to what these funds can be used for. We are looking to see what the flexibility is in terms of supporting different kinds of protection services. But this particular bond, as written right now, does not allow for those kinds of services.
And then to the other question, what about community stabilization kind of at large? If not funded through the bond, what else might we think about?
So I think the preservation dollars that can go, so I think we'll get into that. And we can speak to specific preservation strategies that preserve the existing housing stock. So it's not just the production of new stock that is important. And so I'm happy to have a further conversation about what kind of some of those strategies can look like. I think also it's a real combination of layering protection and services along with place-based preservation strategies as well as production strategies in specific neighborhoods to help stabilize, particularly neighborhoods that are going through significant gentrification and are at risk of displacement. And so using the data to also help target the different funding strategies.
Thank you so much. There is another question in the chat and then one more hand raised I'll go to after. But Rochelle asks, how can we ensure jobs and apprenticeships will be given to Oakland residents? So and if anyone else wants to jump in too, feel free to do so.
President BAHFA, would you like to speak directly to this question? Or?
Sure, I can speak directly to this question. So as you heard earlier when I was speaking, BAHFA, or the Regional Housing Bond, does have a framework around prevailing wage and apprenticeship programs as labor standards. Here in Oakland, we are going through a process of looking at whether there's additional labor standards that we might also attach to our existing bond measure, which is called Measure U, and that could potentially be a jumping off point for Oakland, because at the local level, we can add additional standards. There's some limits in terms of how we do it, in terms of attaching it to the entire county or to this bond measure as a whole. But at the local level, we are looking at how we can do that. And we do have a history with certain projects of targeted hire or local hiring. And so I think that's what we are looking for, knowing that the crisis that we're facing is also an economic crisis in terms of lack of job opportunities. And so in addition to being able to house people, we want to make sure that that housing could potentially be built by Oaklanders and then afforded by Oaklanders. So you can stay tuned to the work of the city over the next couple months as more of that discussion enters our council chambers.
Thank you so much, Council President. We have another hand raised. I hope I'm not pronouncing this, Risa or Risa, allowing you to talk and asking you to unmute. There you go.
Yes, this is Risa.
Risa.
I've been in Oakland for probably 40 years, Alameda County for 45 years. And in that time, the numbers of Black people in Oakland has decreased. We saw in the last census that Black people is the only population that has decreased in Oakland. And I'm wondering if there's any room here where Oaklanders, Black Oaklanders specifically, who have had to leave because cost of housing, if there's a way that they could be targeted for spaces to come back.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The city actually has a local preference already for our affordable housing developments that include a preference for people that have been displaced from Oakland. One of the things that for a lot of our affordable housing projects that require other sources of funds, there are other sources of funds that limit those preferences. So it really depends on how the project is funded. But a local preference is something we specifically want to include in the projects that we as a city help support. And we can also speak to, as we move on into the presentation, the strategies that we are using on the production and preservation side as strategies to impact, they're equity driven and that are specifically targeted to reducing racial disparities across the city.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more questions or hands raised for now. There will be another chance to chime in later on in the presentation, but we'll continue for now. So thank you all so much, and continue to put any questions or comments in the Q&A box if you desire. Well, I guess I'm up for this section. So as Emily just mentioned, we at the City of Oakland, we developed a strategic action plan from 2023 to 2027 last year. And it really, the goal was to think about, for the Measure U dollars that we had just received. Also, we started a new regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA cycle, 8-year period that tracks how much housing we're producing. We wanted to think very intentionally about what our strategy was to develop affordable housing and to preserve existing housing. So last year, we started off with, actually, I should even just say my name is Chris Norman. I'm so sorry. I'm the Chief of Staff for the City of Oakland's Housing and Community Development Department, and just very glad to have you all here today. But yeah, last year, we started off with a stakeholder engagement session, series of sessions that happened between January and May of 2023. We held sessions in every council district within Oakland, met with a number of stakeholders. I think we're going to show you a few of them later on, but hundreds of people had a chance to weigh in and give their thoughts to shape this strategic action plan. We released it in June of 2023, and we've been starting the implementation of the plan up from then up until present. And then one very important thing to note is that we are currently developing a couple of additional other action plans. One focused on homelessness and addressing homelessness specifically for the City of Oakland, and then another one focused on anti-displacement strategies. So the question earlier about how do we stabilize communities, that kind of question might be answered in much more detail in one of our upcoming strategic action plans. And the idea is that these together, one focused on anti-displacement, homelessness, and affordable housing production and preservation, they will form a cohesive, holistic strategy and approach that'll help us kind of see where we're going as a full city in the years to come. But it's a very exciting time, and this is another opportunity again to think about how a bond like this could help further our goals. I really want to name, and as Emily just mentioned, that the City of Oakland is extremely fortunate to have one of the first departments of race and equity in the country. And one thing that the Department of Race and Equity in the City of Oakland has done is they've developed this racial equity impact analysis process. It's a process that, and actually I'm going to speak a little bit slower for the interpreters. It's a process that folks can follow, whether if they're developing policies or programs, to think about who is being impacted the most in terms of racial disparities, and what can we do to close those gaps to make sure that there are no racial disparities in a given topic. So you'll see here that our action plan that we created last year follows this process and the steps listed on this screen. And we'll go over a couple of them now. So to start, we want to think about our goal for this work. What outcomes do we desire? What do we want to do with our dollars and our funds? So last year we had a whole bunch of feedback, and folks ended up with this. Through its resources and programs, Oakland Housing and Community Development Department, HCD, aims to equitably promote housing access for and stem the displacement of Oaklanders most impacted by racial disparities. We didn't necessarily have stem the displacement in here at first, but that was something that came up very frequently and very strongly in our community engagement sessions. So we really wanted to make sure that we put that in there as well. And we really say most impacted by racial disparities because any given topic you look at can have a different experience. And you'll see in a slide, right? Homelessness will look different than overcrowding, which will look different from evictions. So we really want to look at any specific topic and look at the data to understand what people are experiencing in that specific topic. The second step of the racial equity impact analysis process, it's a lot of text, I'm not going to go through everything here, but is to look at some key data that tells you about how different populations are doing. So again, I'm not going to go through everything. The next few slides will cover a few of these, but we really wanted to make sure that our plan was based in data, both qualitative and quantitative, that really tells the story of what Oaklanders are experiencing. The first to highlight is the City of Oakland's Equity Indicators Report that was released in 2018. There is currently an update to this report that should be released hopefully this year. We're aiming for, but it'll be exciting to see what the status is for all of these. But what this did for housing specifically, it looked at 4 topics: affordability, displacement, essential services, and housing quality. And it looked at different indicators like homeownership, rent burden, homelessness, and it gave each of these a score on a scale from 1 to 100 to determine how big are the racial disparities in any given topic. As you can see, homelessness got the lowest score of 1, meaning there are gigantic racial disparities in Oakland when it comes to that issue. Some of the other topics that got low scores include eviction notices and overcrowding at 8 and 22. But even some of the higher scores here, like rent burden at 54 or home ownership with mortgage at 78, that's still out of a possible 100, right? So these disparities are still present and they still exist across every single topic of housing in Oakland. Another thing to note here is that the state sets forward the regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA, the goals every 8 years. And that tells us an expectation for how many units of housing each city or county jurisdiction is expected to produce in that period. So the current cycle we're in is between 2023 and 2031. Then these 8 years, the city of Oakland is expected to produce down here over 26,000 units of housing. That's all kinds of housing. If we're thinking about affordable housing specifically, that is low income, very low income, extremely low income. Those 3 rows together, that equals about 10,200 units. And just for context and reference, currently in Alameda County, a family of 4 is their median income, meaning half of all families earn above that and half of all families earn below it. The median income is about $142,000 a year. It's pretty high. And again, that's for the majority of the county. It's thinking about the area that goes from Berkeley all the way down to Fremont and everything in between. So about half of the families and households in that area make over $142,000 and half of them make under. So when we talk about who is low income, we're thinking about who is making 80% of that. So families, households, I would say at about 112,000 or below. That is what we're considering low income, very low income, and extremely low income. And again, about 10,200 units over this 8-year period. I thought those are a lot of numbers. happy to chat tomorrow if anyone wants to. We can talk about it in more detail. Now, a really important piece here, and we actually have even more updated numbers now, is that the point in time count. So about every 2 years, partners go out to estimate the number of unhoused folks throughout the city and the region. The most recent one was actually conducted this past January of 2024, and we had record numbers of volunteers going out to count the number of unhoused folks on the streets in Oakland. And as we see here, there was a steady increase year by year. Of 2022, there was about 5,055 unhoused individuals in Oakland, and I think I'm gonna get this wrong. The current numbers that I think were just came out in the press release was at about 5,400 plus or so, right? There's about a 9% increase in this past 2-year period, but we consider that progress in many ways because the increase from 2019 to 2022 was significantly higher. It was like 24% jump, right? So a 9% jump means yes, there was an increase, but it's at a much slower rate than it has been in the past.
Oh my God, that's something to be.
Hi, Risa. Hi. Now, I think it's really important, though, that we break this down to understand who is unhoused in Oakland. And when we look at this from a racial equity lens, and really look at the Black population, we see that whereas 21% of Oakland's Black population, whereas 21% of Oakland's population is Black, they represent over 59% of Oakland's unhoused population. Again, this is from the 2022 numbers, so we are going to get updated numbers in the coming few months. But 21% of Oakland's population versus 59% of the unhoused Oakland population, that's a huge disparity. And it shows that why, the racial disparity score of 1 that we saw earlier, why it makes sense here. Across the board, it is the biggest disparity, the gap between the two. When we think about current housing development, what it takes to build and preserve affordable housing now, we're at about $900,000 or so per unit, per new construction unit to build here at Oakland. Thankfully, there are a number of sources that we can leverage funds from at the state or federal levels. So we as a city of Oakland, we put in about $200,000 per unit. And then the developers go and they raise other money from other sources. It takes about 3 to 4 years or so to actually make one of these projects come online from construction onwards. And then the thought here is that if we want to keep these units deeply affordable, meaning people might pay upwards of 30% of their income to this, we need a few extra dollars here to help make sure that we're keeping it affordable long term. These buildings depend on rents to be able to pay off their existing loans, their operations, all of the above. If the rents that people pay are lower than what it actually costs, that creates a gap. And that gap is what we're talking about with this number here that allows us to continue operating the building ongoing. So it's a lot of money per unit. And you'll see in a second, we have hundreds of $millions that came through Measure U, and it feels like a drop in the bucket sometimes because it's such an expensive operation, but it's one that we are deeply committed to and that we absolutely need for our residents. Even when we think about things like preservation, we have a program in which we fund developers and land trusts to buy and acquire buildings that are currently market rate and make them affordable long term. The average cost per unit is about $350,000 there. And we as a city pretty much fund most of that because there aren't sources for those folks to go and leverage at other places like the state. Lastly, I want to name our Home Key or Rapid Response Homeless Housing, R2H2 program, which is an exciting kind of new program. Council had adopted it last June in the last budget cycle. But it's our opportunity to think about what are the existing buildings that we can take and create opportunities for homeless housing in them. The city of Oakland has received 9 awards from the state of California to build to produce these Home Key projects. And we're so proud of that. It's a large number. We've had about 3 every single round so far. And it's been something that we're seeing a lot more of, and we're excited to have that continue. So all of this came through. We talked about, all this information with these various community members, funding partners, and other folks throughout the city and our other government partners to think about, how do we do this work? How do we operationalize it? What are things we should consider? And it all really came down into these guiding principles. I'm not going to read these all, but the thought here is that every single year, the political landscape will change, the funding levels will change, but we want to have these things at the center of our decision making. We want to base all of our decisions in equity. We want to make all of our allocations and decision making based on data, as you've seen before. We want to make sure we're reducing development costs and time. That $900,000 a unit is expensive, and it's only been going up. So we need to make sure we're doing whatever we can to lower that cost. We also recognize that, not all the systems that exist right now work for Oakland. Not all the funding, school opportunities, et cetera, meet our needs. So we want to be able to get money from the state and other partners, but we also want to make sure that we're advocating at those levels for policy change. And we reserve the right to stay nimble and to adjust any of this as we need, as we learn how it's all working. Whew, almost there. One more slide. But what this came to is we developed our capital investment equity framework last year. And it really talks about, from all the data that we got, how do we plan to use our dollars? And specifically, how do we use them with that racial equity lens? So what this shows here is that we want to fund as many areas as possible, but we do start from our priority strategies. As we saw, because homelessness has the biggest racial disparities, and we're thinking about not just race, but also class, and who is most at risk here, we really prioritize the development of permanent supportive housing and other homeless units as the top of our equity framework. And just to note, permanent supportive housing, it means you have a big, housing development with affordable units in them, but they also have supportive services on site, like case managers and folks that can help you navigate job applications, mental health, substance abuse, all of the above. The idea is that you're really pairing that housing and the services together in one place to help stabilize residents. So that is something that a lot of the unhoused population would benefit from. And that's what we really want to focus our attention on to start. It might not be this way forever, but we know that right now it is the largest priority that we're seeing in our city. We can only build so much here, right? Because we don't have enough money to subsidize that gap that I talked about earlier between what people can pay and what it actually costs to run the building. So because we're limited for how much we can actually build here, you see this waterfall, it flows down into the next priority, which is other affordable units between 30 to 80% of AMI. Again, 80% of the area median income is talking about $112,000 or under per year in Alameda County. Once we are developing as much as we can here, we will think about preservation and make sure we're putting adequate dollars into those areas to make sure that we're keeping our housing habitable, safe, and affordable. And then we are saying that, through this framework, items like first-time homebuyer support, low moderate income owner occupied rehabilitation, those are not as high of a priority for our funding right now. We're not saying they're not important. They are extremely important. And the idea here, and we go back to the guiding principles, is that we will leverage funding and pursue all opportunities we can. So if opportunities come up at the state or other levels, we're going to go after those dollars. We don't want to leave any money on the table. But when we're thinking about the limited resources that we have right now, what our priority is as a city is to invest into housing for unhoused folks. And I know there was a question earlier about what about protections? A lot of the protection services, homelessness prevention, anti-displacement, eviction defense, those are non-capital dollars. So we can't use bond funds, general obligation bond funds to pay for those. But as I mentioned, there is a separate strategic action plan being developed right now that will speak to what we do with those services. It's a lot of information, but Emily, back to you. What does all that mean?
So now it's the exciting part. What does all of this mean? So as Chris just explained, last year, I know many of you were actually involved in the process. We did the strategic action planning process so we could determine how to best spend our Measure U dollars and our other sources of housing funds. And this capital investment equity framework is intended to be evergreen. It's intended to guide the way we spend our dollars, those that we have in hand, and hopefully the BAHFA funds that will be coming down the pike based on voters in November. So based on this equity investment framework, we have projected, first, just to explain sort of the way that the city allocates its funds, we have what are called Notice of Funding Availabilities, or NOFAs. And currently, HCD has 4 different NOFA programs. The first, and that we've focused a lot on today, is the new construction. That's the creation of our multifamily affordable rental apartments. And right now, in our NOFAs, we have different scoring criteria. It's really important, as Chris mentioned, that we align our scoring with the state so that we can maximize and leverage as much state dollars as possible. But we also prioritize things like the percentage of extremely low income units, PSH units, the location of the units, and we try to prioritize those areas, those neighborhoods that are experiencing displacement, as well as also supporting emerging developers of color as a priority. We also have our home key, or rapid response homeless housing, NOFA. And this is a little bit different. Our rapid response homeless housing came out of the last budget cycle, and it is structured just like home key, just like the state's home key funding program, but it is on a rolling basis. So developers or service providers can come to the city with a project proposal and be evaluated basically for underwriting for our different funding sources. Many of these projects, because they have to leverage dollars for either capital or for operating dollars, may need to kind of sit in a queue for the next state home key round. But we are also evaluating, we have a number of projects that came through recently that we are evaluating that may be able to move forward without home key dollars. The other NOFA we have is our acquisition and conversion to affordable housing. This is really one of our strongest preservation and anti-displacement strategies. It converts, we say market rate rentals, but these are not high-end rentals. These are kind of naturally occurring affordable housing that is on the market. And we think it's important to help stabilize those units and provide long-term deed restrictions so that they maintain affordability for at least 55 years or into perpetuity. And then finally, we have a preservation NOFA, which goes to supporting the rehab needs of our existing portfolio of affordable housing to make sure that those assets are healthy and providing the impact that and security for their tenants. So that's the way we allocate the funding. And based on our equity investment framework and our existing sources of funds, what you see on the screen here is what we have projected with our Measure U dollars. So based on our current Measure U funding and our local capital dollars and that equity framework, we anticipate being able to produce and preserve around 2,400 units. You'll see the breakdown of how the funds are used in the second to last column. And so when asked about preservation, it really is a combination of the acquisition and conversion, that 13%, as well as the preservation of our existing portfolio, an additional 8%. And then we have anticipated a flexible pool of around 5%. Now, if we look, and this is the most exciting slide, if we look at what BAHFA could do, so based on our strategic action plan, based on our equity investment framework, guided by our goals and our guiding principles for that strategic action plan, if BAHFA is passed as a $20 billion regional bond, then the city can expect to basically triple what we could produce with Measure U and produce and preserve over 7,000 units. The breakdown of how those funds will be spent is very similar to what the spending would look like without the bond in terms of percentage. But you'll see basically the BAHFA bond allows us to kind of supersize all of the different funding streams for these different programs. Next slide. So just to kind of hammer it home, you can see the difference here on the screen, the difference between what we can produce and preserve with our current funding and what we could produce and preserve with the BAHFA $20 billion bond. So this should make you run out and want to support the BAHFA bonds. Scream it from the rooftop, both the BAHFA bond as well as ACI1. It's really important that we raise awareness about the BAHFA bond and that people really understand what it means for Oakland and for Oaklanders. I know that was a lot of information. I believe we're gonna
have a chance to, and I just want to reiterate too, again, that like these are affordable units specifically, right? We're not talking about market rate development here. We're talking about low-end units for folks that are low income, very low income, and extremely low income. This first row, permanent homeless units, that is extremely low income, focused on 0 to 30% of the AMI, and then the rest of it 30 to 80% of the AMI. You know, it's over 4,000 units right there, right? The biggest potential investment that the city has ever made in deeply affordable housing. So it's an exciting opportunity, and one that we can't tell you to vote for, but if you did, this is what it would look like.
So with
all
that,
right, please.
Yeah, we want to just kind of pause. We know it was a lot of information. It's a lot of data. Our strategic action plan really sets the framework. And so we want to just kind of open it up. What do you think about the projected number of units? What do you think about the housing goals and the strategic action plan that are guiding the investment framework? Love to open it up. I see that Risa has her hand up.
Yes, there's Risa, Pastor Jennings, and then there's a few comments in the chat that we'll go to. But Risa, I'm asking you to unmute first.
Yes, can you go back to the previous slide, please?
This one?
Yes, thank you. Here's my concern. Because 80% of AMI is significantly different from 30% of AMI, and there's no breakout of what units are going to be built in that range. And my concern is that the focus will be on the 80% because to spread the dollars and all of that. I can't get too concerned about the people who are making six figures because we have so many people who are not even making the 80%, and it's that's my concern. We are not breaking this out in a way that feels like the dollars are going to be focused where they really need to be focused.
Yeah, that I can see that. It seems it is a wide income range. I will say, so the permanent homeless units, one of the things that you want to do is allow people to live in a unit as their income changes. So part of the variation is to allow, for example, the permanent homeless units are people that make 0 to 30% AMI. There are some people exiting homelessness that do have income. And so if we just had it at the lower end of the spectrum.
Yeah, but just for clarity, I'm asking specifically not about the permanent homeless units. I'm asking about the, and I understand, I hear you saying there's a range, but how do we address who's getting in those? I hear what you're talking about, that people should be allowed to stay when they get higher. But my point is still, how do we know that we're going to focus on people who are getting in here now sooner, are on that lower end and not on that high end to start with?
So you're speaking specifically of the 30 to 80% AMI.
Yes.
So part of it has to do with the way that projects are funded. We almost actually never see the 80% AMI units because almost all affordable housing new production units require tax credits, and you only get tax credits on projects basically at 60% area median income and below. So these are the categories that we are required to meet based on state requirements. These are not categories that we set. These are the AMIs that are set at the state or really at the federal level. But we really do get a range, and projects are prioritized based on state policy goals. So many of the projects actually have lower rent levels so that they are more competitive at the state.
Okay, thank you.
And I would also even add there that the state doesn't require us to even focus on 0 to 30% AMI. They only consider low income and very low income. But as the city of Oakland, we know that it is a priority to focus on that deeply, extremely low income population, which is why we specifically call out the 0 to 30% range as well.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Risa. Pastor Jennings, allow you to, oh, are you there? Did you lower? Oh, there you're still there. All right. Ask you to unmute, Pastor Jennings.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Chris and Emily, for the presentation. And certainly we are individually as a congregation supportive of the bond measure, and certainly doing our work to make sure it spreads throughout the faith-based community in terms of talking it up. So I have a multi-part question, if I may. As it relates to the guiding principles, you talked about the number one guiding principle was the basing all the decisions and processes in equity. I'd like to hear what that process really looks like in terms of equity in the process. And more specifically, and if you can target in on that, are there going to be maybe incentive points for small and emerging developers and maybe even faith-based developers as it relates to the work that we're doing with churches to convert church-owned property into housing? And so what is that? I understand the guiding principles, but how does that really come to fruition? And then the other part is, one of the other areas that were mentioned in terms of the funding was that flexible fund, the flexible component, if you will. In that flexible component, has there been any thought about how maybe some small grants could be given to organizations to help build the capacity of some of the emerging developers as it relates to this whole equity piece? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is already within our NOFA point structure, we do have prioritization and increased points for emerging developers and small developers of color. I think we are constantly iterating on our NOFA scoring criteria. And actually the REA process, the racial equity impact analysis process that Chris walked through, is we showed that as the guiding sort of strategy and process to create our strategic action plan. We also do a REA analysis we'll be doing one for our new construction NOFA in the next coming months. And we do it as part of our policy and program design. So that's the way we make sure that we are very explicit about what is the disproportionate racial impact that we are trying to reduce within whether it's a program or a policy or the NOFA point system. So that I think hit on your first question. And in terms of building capacity, that is something that we've been talking a lot about. There are different ways to do that. We are actually right now in the process of considering a revamp, or taking to council, I should say, we're close, taking a revamp of the acquisition and conversion to affordable housing program, where we can partner with a CDFI that can then do much more of the technical assistance, hand-holding, as well as allocate the funding on more of a rolling basis. It's something the city really has a tough time doing just because of the way that we're structured, and because we don't have as much of kind of dedicated resources to that. So there are things within our process that we are doing to try to assist more emerging developers in like the acquisition conversion to affordable housing. I think there's also a lot more partnerships. There's, the county has their initiative around emerging developers. And so we also want to really be clear on where we can partner with the county and make sure we're not duplicating efforts. And so that's one of the areas I've been talking a lot to Michelle Sterrett about their program and seeing, where we could bolster it, or whether we need, like the city needs its own program. But it is something we're looking into.
Yeah. I know Dylan and Pauline Blackwell from Alameda County. Is there anything you'd want to share about the emerging developer work at the county level?
Pauline does lead that work, so I will let her step in if she feels like I'm missing anything. But the good news is, we've had a lot of feedback with that cohort as we've moved through a couple of different capacity building programs, and now we've really been able to take that feedback to build in some requirements to our RFP process for the last of our Measure A1 funds. So we're really looking to continue to build out that pipeline for our emerging developers with pre-development funds, which we're hoping to make available this summer. So that's our big push with emerging developers next.
Thank you.
And I'll also add that we are also revamping our pre-development program. It had basically become kind of functionally obsolete, particularly for small developers and developers of color. And so we are working on revamping that and using the REA, the racial equity analysis, to help guide that program design.
Thank you so much.
Did that hit on all parts of the question, Pastor Jennings?
I don't know if I'm still muted or not.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, it did. And one of the things you mentioned, Emily, thank you so very much for that. But how is the city defining emerging developers? Because I know that is a conversation at the county level. And so it would be interesting to know how the city is really defining emerging developers and whether there is any community input relative to how that gets defined.
Yeah, I don't want to misspeak because I know there was a lot of attention paid for that definition in the last round of the NOFA. Chris, do you remember the explicit definition that we ended up using?
We can. I can in a second put the link into the chat to. It's written down in our NOFA scoring criteria, and it describes there explicitly what that looks like, and that went through revisions, multiple revisions. But give me a second. At some point. All right, Richmond Neighborhood Housing Services. I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Thank you, Chris. Nikki Beasley, Richmond Neighborhood Housing Services. And one of the questions I had on the chat, slide 18, was trying to understand the equity scoring. What was the pool? Is that like out of 1,000, out of 100? How did the scoring get tabulated in getting to those numbers? Oh, a different slide on mine. This is the housing data overview from what was sent in the link it's showing on my presentation, slide 18.
This one?
Yes.
The equity indicators report?
Indicators.
So how did we tabulate those scores?
No, good question. I am not super familiar. So the Department of Race and Equity led this analysis. I would have to ask them about that. But I also, Andre, if you're listening, we could put the link to this report in the chat. I am sure they cover it in there, and I'd be happy to look at that and pull out whatever is relevant. But I can't speak specifically to how they tabulated it right now.
Appreciate it. And then I guess my question is also around equity. As we know, affordability is identified in a couple of ways, whether it is based on their AMI level or an individual's ability to pay, where no more than 30% of their income goes toward housing. So for the smaller, infield small sites where we know Oakland has a lot of blight in certain neighborhoods, how are these funds looking to allocate maybe low density, smaller sites to either address the preservation or protection component of this work?
Yeah, so I think most directly, it would be through our acquisition and conversion program. Kind of iterating on that program to ensure that it's meeting the needs of developers. Nikki, I think you've been part of our recent conversations. The first step for us is, instead of having the once a year NOFA or once every 2 year NOFA, that just doesn't work for smaller developers, for being able to, react to the market. First is about kind of the program design change. And I think working with the CDFI, if this is passed by council, that being able to see how that unlocks more properties will kind of remain to be seen. We'll have to see kind of how it plays out. You had a second part of your question. You had about the small site.
Just the, idea. I know based on the matrix, ownership isn't the highest priority, but addressing the infield small site could address some of the affordable housing needs for affordability for people that are looking for home ownership.
Yeah, and I don't think, I think one of the things that we want to make clear is none of these sort of types of projects are off the table. So just because it's for lower down on the equity spectrum as it relates to both race and class, it does not mean that it's not also a need or a focus for the city. I think one of the things that we are really looking at is, right now the state doesn't have a lot of funding, but what are different programs that could come from the state or even from the county? We've been talking about what kind of home ownership supports, home ownership type of programs could exist. I think it remains to be seen. It is not right now where we are putting our funding dollars. So I think there's a lot of, and we've heard it, we know it, that intergenerational wealth, and we're talking about equity. Obviously, it's extremely important. But again, we'll go back to kind of this equity framework in terms of looking at race and class and this particular racial disparities with the homeless population as being the focus right now.
Understood. And my last comment is the, ask or consideration could be to maybe do a carve out for smaller sites, because I know us and others, if we go for a project because of need, if we don't have enough units, it may not be considered, but if there could be some of those funds that were set aside for smaller projects, because we know that could do a lot in communities that have been ignored because of the blight in some of these areas that need to be, revitalized.
Nikki, are you talking specifically like smaller but new construction projects? Or
I guess, and in both. I'm thinking about blighted properties that are just vacant, as well as vacant land that could, produce new construction.
Yeah. Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Just a couple notes. I put the new construction NOFA description and has a definition of emerging developers. I responded I put the link in there, Pastor Jennings, and then to Nikki, I put the link to the equity indicators report there as well. So one more hand up, or two more hands up. Carla, I'm gonna ask you to unmute and talk now.
Hey everyone, this is more like a confirmation rather than a question. I want to make sure that I'm understanding this right. Thank you for the presentation. I'm learning a lot. I'm actually new to this topic, so I'm really interested in learning more. My question is regarding the unit projections. I think there was on slide 33, the unit projections achievable with the bond funding, which I think aims to reach, there we go, the 7,032 units. Yep. So to ensure this goal is met, will the funding be released as NOFAs to developers to participate in building these units, or are this exclusively city-based projects? And additionally, the second question is, if the bond passes, then what will be the estimated timeline for the NOFAs to be released after this year? Thanks.
Great question. So the city allocates its funds through the NOFA process. We think of us more as like an investor in the affordable housing projects. We don't do our own projects. And so the NOFA is our public process to allocate those funds. What we have heard, so we basically have been doing a new construction NOFA about every year or year and a half. Our acquisition and conversion has also been a kind of on that timeline. As I mentioned, we would like to revamp our processes so that we are able to move the money out faster And the way we would do that is for the new construction NOFA, we're actually looking to do a combination of kind of open pool new construction NOFA, and then alternate that with funding projects through our pipeline the following year, and kind of toggling back and forth, so that developers don't have to keep applying every single year, even if their project hasn't changed. When it comes to a lot of the permanent supportive housing in our home key or R2H2, those rapid response homeless housing, that NOFA or the R2H2 program is meant to be on a rolling basis. And so we have projected basically the amount of bond funds, the amount of Measure U funds that we would put towards that program. And we go to council to be able to allocate the different pots of funds to that program. And then the same is with the acquisition and conversion. We are right now, we've been doing these once a year, once every year and a half NOFAs, but instead we will be hopefully revamping this program so that it is on a rolling basis. In terms of the timeline, we imagine that our Measure U funds will likely be allocated within the next 2 years. It doesn't mean they'll all be spent down, but they will be allocated to projects who then go to the state or to other sources to leverage funds. We have heard that BAHFA will be allocated in a series of tranches, probably, I believe it's going to be 3 to 5 tranches over, I believe it's a 5 to 7 year period.
Yeah, and just to jump in very quickly, so if the voters approve the bond this coming November in 2024, then cities and counties will be required to submit their expenditure plans starting February 1st of 2025. So there will be a built-in 2 or 3 month period in which different agencies will have to create their plans, do the analysis, get it approved by their local councils or board of supervisors, and then they would submit the plans to BAHFA no sooner than February 1st, 2025. And then with that, it would go through a whole kind of process of approval for BAHFA, and then I think they said maybe late 2025, early 2026, the first tranche of funds would be available then. All right, I know there's a lot of questions. One more from Sharon Cornu, and then we're gonna move on. I know there's some questions in the chat. We'll try to get to those at the end of the session. But Sharon, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your taking the question. I want to build off a question that was asked earlier, and this comes from St. Mary's Center seniors who have been following this process very closely. We know there's new state legislation that requires cities and counties to do planning at the acutely low income level, income so low it impacts your health. So that's 0% of the area median income up to 15%. That's our seniors on SSI. That's many of the people, not everyone for sure, as was mentioned earlier, but many of the people experiencing homelessness. And I want to ask, what are the plans within the buckets that you're showing for targeting and making sure that the allocation goes to those in greatest need? And thank you for tonight's meeting.
Yeah, so based on our equity framework, as well as those buckets you see on, we are prioritizing the permanent homeless units. So PSH units, we are looking at the units that come with deep rental subsidies and services. And so those really are targeted for people exiting homelessness that may not have any income. And those projects with a larger percentage of those units are prioritized in our NOFA structure. It's also the focus of all of our home key and R2H2 projects. I think that answered your question. I mean, we are focused on that. We have not called out that particular bands because what we're calling out here are the AMI bands that are being used at the federal, state, and regional level.
When we look at the new California Department of Housing and Community Development income levels, they are tracking acutely low income. as a separate bucket from 0 to 30, 0 to 15. And we'll continue to monitor this and work with you
Yep.
so that we can make sure that those needs are addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, we know there are a couple more questions and comments in the chat. We'll get to them at the end of the session, but I would love for us to move on. Dylan, I'll be passing it to you next to talk a little bit about Alameda County's process.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the handoff, and it's great to be here. My name is Dylan Sweeney. For those of you who don't know me, I manage the policy and programs team at the county's Department of Housing and Community Development. It's great to be here on behalf of County HCD, but also as a resident of D2 and D3 in Highland Park and Oakland. We kicked off our public process last fall with the release of our HCD housing needs analysis. That's a report we released that worked to quantify the changes that we've experienced as a county since the year 2000 and how the housing needs of the county have changed between then and now. And we've used that as the basis for a series of conversations we've been having around the county to collect public and stakeholder feedback. So like in Oakland, this process is aligned kind of with a new era that we're facing and challenges and opportunities. Obviously the BAHFA bond and the new RENA cycle, but also the allocation and release of essentially all of our Measure A1 dollars and the end of substantial COVID emergency funding. This process is in preparation of forming Alameda County HCD strategic plan, which we're calling the housing plan right now to keep simple. And it will inform the expenditure plan if and when the regional bond passes. So in order to support this process, we launched the website that you see here on the screen, Housing Needs AC. On that website, you can find the report I just mentioned. And even more importantly, you can log on there and actually provide feedback to us through a survey that we've linked there. This survey has been live since last fall in October. The numbers that you're seeing are a bit old. We've gotten about 8,000 views, 5,000 unique visitors, and over 860 survey responses. Again, this survey is still live, so please pass it to anyone who's a resident of Alameda County that you think you'd like their voice heard on this subject. We're hoping to get to at least 1,000 survey responses. So next slide. We operated our community feedback process as sort of a two-lane process. One was organized with supervisors and their staff, where we held 7 public meetings all around the county, and we focused on 4 questions. How have high housing costs impacted you personally? How do you perceive high housing costs have impacted your community? What solution types, modes would you like prioritized, and which populations would you like to see prioritized for service? The second lane we went through was a stakeholder engagement process to get feedback from community groups that were organized, as well as many of the organizations that we partner with to build affordable housing projects or provide services to at-risk communities or that are embedded within those affordable housing projects. And we really wanted to get feedback about, gaps in funding, acute needs, and lack of services, as well as feedback from, the lessons that we learned during the Measure A1 rollout over the last 6 or 7 years. Next slide. So this is a picture from one of those meetings. I believe this is at the Fremont Public Library. You can even see me a little bit in the front, but we were hoping to get feedback from everybody. And I do anticipate that once we release the draft of our housing plan, we will probably begin to go through this process again and get more community feedback on that draft housing plan in advance of November. Next slide. Really briefly, what did we learn? The full report on this process will be included in that housing plan when it's finalized and approved this summer. But here on the screen are some of our big picture takeaways from that public process that we're going to try to take into our strategic plan. Our job now is to sort of build that in a way that we believe makes sense and is accountable. Separately from these individual priorities, I think it's worth noting that the big picture finding was that no matter where you live in the county, with barely any variation at all, housing costs are the top or a top issue, and it impacts county residents really deeply and really personally. So residents who are adamant that providing shelter and housing for all people, but especially vulnerable populations, is a basic responsibility of the government that they're not seeing accomplished. And we also heard that even moderate income residents are really experiencing substantial impacts from high housing costs personally, but also, even more acutely through friends, family, and children and colleagues who can't afford to live in Alameda County and are really impacted by that housing cost burden. So we're taking very seriously building a framework that's equitable, that serves these critical needs in the county, the most critical needs first, but that also provides an array of services that are diverse enough to kind of meet the diverse housing related needs across the wider county. And we also just wanted to point out, since we have folks in the room, that we heard loud and clear that building up emerging developers and community land trusts and even other more emergent models is going to be a huge priority for us in this document and with any funds that we have available, primarily as a matter of equity, but also just to access opportunities for building out our housing system that smaller local organizations are best positioned to reach. And I think those are sort of our key takeaways at the county level, but I may not have a question and answer, but I am available here if anyone has any questions about our process.
Thank you so much, Dylan. And I think one thing, and I love your cat is welcome anytime too. And I think one thing I really want to name is that, all the types of programs that we're offering at the City of Oakland, we really want them to be complementary with the county, with Alameda County's offerings as well, right? Whereas the city is not necessarily prioritizing maybe funding for first-time homebuyer support, the county has, I think applications just closed for AC Boost in mid-May, right? So I think there's a parity there where we're really trying to support one another, recognizing that Oakland is the biggest city in the county, that all residents of Oakland are Alameda County residents. So it's really important for us to be in discussion and lockstep about what our complete suite of services looks like for our residents, for our community partners, et cetera. So thank you for being here and for sharing a little bit about that. And then folks, please pay attention to what's coming in later this year from the county. It's going to be an exciting process. Next steps.
So just want to recap kind of the timeline of events. Between April and June, BAHFA and its executive board will vote to approve the regional expenditure plan. During this period, BAHFA and ABAG, the executive board, will also vote to place the bond on this upcoming November ballot in all 9 Bay Area counties. Then in November, it's the big day, Election Day. And remember, it's not just BAHFA, but also ACA 1 as well. And then finally, if the bond is passed, beginning in 2025 and beyond, there will be local public meetings to approve local expenditure plans, which will have opportunities for the public to weigh in on different expenditure plans. So what is important over the next few months is to stay informed and engage. We believe staying informed and being involved matters. So here are some quick links on how to stay updated and continue to stay involved. I know there are a variety of people even on this call here. I'll shout out St. Mary's, who is organizing people and organizing seniors to get out the vote and update people and educate people on the bond. And then finally, next slide. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's really important, again, that we have an educated, that Oaklanders are educated about this bond and what it could mean, and that people are excited about it. This really will be transformational in terms of the number of affordable housing units that we will be able to produce really for decades. This is a game changer, not only for kind of the money that we'll be receiving as direct allocation, but also the money that BAHFA will be retaining as a public bank. It will be then our ongoing source of funding for affordable housing, which is something we have just not had since the end of redevelopment. So it's extremely exciting. And yeah, we're here to offer more information and answer any questions.
Thank you. And we'll get to a couple more of the questions. I do just want to note that Andre has put in the chat a few links. Number one, please visit our City of Oakland BAHFA Bond website. You'll see Q&A on the site. Sorry, not Q&A, an FAQ, frequently asked questions, where we try to get some answers to many of the questions that we've been hearing, and we'll be updating that as needed. Also on our City of Oakland BAHFA Bond website, there is a recording of our previous session, covers the same topics, content as we did tonight, but feel free to go back and review that recording, the content, share it with whoever is just so excited about this and make sure to share it wide. And also the slide deck that we used tonight and in our previous sessions is also posted on that website so that anyone can go download it, review it, and email us here at hcd@oaklandca.gov with any additional feedback or questions that you might have. I think so this is 7:29. If you got to go, please go. We are going to take just a few last questions. But before we do that, Council President, Supervisor, are there any words you'd like to share as we close up today?
I want to thank all the presenters, you, Chris, Emily, and Dylan. As Emily mentioned, this is going to be a transformative impact with this regional bond measure. We're expecting about 1.5 billion coming toward the county to create more livable communities. And we're happy to continue this level of engagement and participate in partnership with the city of Oakland or any other community-based organizations that would like to learn more.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll also just share my appreciation for having this opportunity for us as your elected officials and your city and county leaders to engage with all of you, whether you are an interested resident or a developer or somebody else who's engaged in this continuum of issues that we're working on, including serving our homeless residents. I think for me, this is really an opportunity to engage broadly prior to the city and the county adopting our spending plans. There's a lot more Q&A that we'd like to do that we don't have time for. I will try to answer at least one of them in terms of how we build affordable housing faster. I think it's worth noting that the East 12th Street project that we mentioned earlier, not only was it one of the first projects to break ground using Measure U funding, it was also Oakland's first project to be entitled using the State Affordable Housing Streamlining Bill, AB 2162. So it broke ground about 15 months after being approved by City Council. So I think that's just an example of how from the city to the county to the state and federal levels, we have a real opportunity to coordinate, collaborate, and really make sure we're addressing both the homelessness crisis and the housing affordability crisis. And in return, hopefully stemming displacement and gentrification and also creating good living wage jobs along the way. And my office certainly looks forward to engaging with all of you as we go forward.
Thank you, everybody, again for joining us tonight, and thank you for those closing words. There's some. I know the comment section wasn't available here, but there's a lot of nice things coming through in the Q&A. So I really appreciate that all of you have been here, have been engaged, and let us wrap up with just a few more questions that have been there because we committed to that. Risa, I will ask you to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Just want to share a thought. It feels like a game of whack-a-mole trying to get housing for all the people who need housing. And so I'm wondering how we move away from a culture where housing is a commodity and something that we need to work on as a community. Thanks.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree. And I think part of it actually is the ability to tax ourselves for housing, for what is important infrastructure, health infrastructure, is a good first step.
Thank you. Council President Bass?
If I could just jump in, I'll be brief. I think it's really notable that we have a preservation strategy, not only in this regional bond measure, also in the city of Oakland. That is something that was created in partnership with tenants organizations and community land trusts. I played a role in sort of helping to get that off the ground in 2019, but it's really taken on a life of its own, including with co-ops and, deed restrictions to make what's currently rental units permanently affordable over the course of 55 years, I think is really important. And that's through land trusts as well as cooperatives. And I think that is really remarkable, the fact that this bond measure has a preservation strategy. And I think we should really hone in on that part as part of the strategy that you mentioned, Risa.
Thank you so much. No, just a couple more, then we're done. Derek Barnes asks, what other production strategies are we considering as part of the plan to increase more below market rate housing beyond commercial conversions and new build initiatives? You know, things like ADUs, habitability remediation, off-market units, etc.
Yeah, I can't speak to every single one of those strategies. I think it's it's one of those things where we consider kind of all strategies, right? There's a lot of changes we've made from on land use and entitlement side to make ADUs easier to build, to reduce sort of the hurdles to building ADUs and other sort of different models of housing. When it comes to providing financing for ADUs, the city, you know, as one of our guiding principles, we're not going to leave any money on the table, and we have been very, very successful at going after any state programs that exist. And so I'm trying to remember, Chris, the loans that we're providing for low-income ADU development.
They were, I don't know if it's still open, but they were targeted towards opportunity zones in Oakland, particular geographic areas in which that have been historically disadvantaged. So I think we still have our website up that describes that program. But if the funds aren't currently open right now, then it's possible that they'll be open again in the future should more funding arise. And it would kind of follow similar guidelines. So,
yeah.
Thank you. And just one more question. I want to make sure we get at least one question from the different people who have commented. But Oscar says, this is another parcel tax that will be used specifically to finance building affordable housing, correct? Is there anything in this to streamline the building of affordable housing units? Because, you know, it doesn't matter how much funds we get if they're locked up behind permitting delays, amongst others.
Yeah, we are very excited that as part of our housing element and the zoning changes, we the city council approved a affordable housing overlay, which basically encompasses almost the entire city except for the fire-prone areas. And so with that affordable housing overlay, all affordable housing is approved ministerially, so basically over the counter. And that was something that was done to speed up the entitlement process. There's obviously a number of continued process changes that we can also always iterate on, but that is a goal for the city to make it cheaper and faster to build affordable housing.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure we got at least one question from different people who chimed in. But that brings us to the end. So thank you again, everybody. And yeah, we will try to post this recording as well to the website. But there'll at least be one full session up there so you can review as needed. The slides are up there. And just make sure that you continue to spread the word if you are in support of this. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time on this Monday evening.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
And thank you, Andre, behind the scenes, making this all happen.
Thank you, Andre.
No worries. Thanks, everyone.
Pushing it forward.
Great job, everyone.